There's a clip from Ohio Senator J.D. Vance's old Senate campaign going around. Have you seen this yet?
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. They've played their entire lives to win a status game. They're obsessed with their jobs, and they hate normal Americans for choosing family over these ridiculous DC and New York status games.
Women taking care of cats instead of kids is apparently everything that is wrong with America and something that exists entirely because of Democrats. Now, beyond being a really weird belief, Vance's view here has a distinctly authoritarian bent. Vance has openly praised this policy from Hungary's authoritarian dictator Viktor Orban, one that encourages native Hungarian mothers, native ones, to have 4 or more children. The idea there is to repopulate the country with white Christians instead of Muslim immigrants. J.D. Vance also thinks that if you don't have children, your vote shouldn't count as much as those who do, which is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of conservative domination, assuming all childless cat ladies are Democrats.
Give votes to all children in this country, but let's give control over those votes to the parents of those children. When you go to the polls in this country as a parent, you should have more power. You should have more of an ability to speak your voice in our democratic republic than people who don't have kids.
Vance has also advocated for creating an economic system that reinvigorates jobs specifically for American men. Because according to J.D. Vance, families suffer more when men are employed than they do when women are.
The decline of manufacturing hit male employment much harder than it hit female employment. And one of the things we see consistently is that when men are unemployed, it's very hard for them to maintain, to build families themselves. And so I do think that well, this makes maybe some people uncomfortable in the audience. The fact that we lost a lot of stable male employment was a catastrophe for the American family.
Throughout his political career, J.D. Vance has pushed for an economic populism premised on men working and women being married and staying married and having children whether they want to or not.
The question really to me is about the baby. We want women to have opportunities. We want women to have choices. But above all, we want women and young boys in the womb to have the right to life.
This is one of the great tricks that I think the sexual revolution pulled on the American populace, which is this idea that, like, well, okay, these marriages were fundamentally, you know, they were maybe even violent, but certainly they were unhappy, and so getting rid of them and making it easier for people to shift spouses like they change their underwear, that's going to make people happier in the long term. And maybe it worked out for the moms and dads, though I'm skeptical, but it really didn't work out for the kids of those marriages.
In a new piece titled J.D. Vance's Sad, Strange Politics of Family, New Yorker contributing editor Jessica Winter unpacks Vance's newly resurfaced concerns about childless cat ladies by taking a look at Vance's own family. Winter writes, a close read of Vance's grandmother's plight reveals striking similarities between Vance's guardian angel and the ideal matriarch who emerges from Vance's political platform. Their place is at home. Their job, which they have no choice whether to quit, is to have babies. What results is a blinkered, grotesquely narcissistic vision of the social contract, an identity politics of one grown child. Joining me now are Jessica Winter, contributing editor at The New Yorker, and Sam Stein, managing editor of The Bulwark. Thank you guys both for being here. Jessica, first, let me tell you I very much enjoyed this read. And I wonder if you could explain the way in which J.D. Vance's grandmother's story is, in a way, the Rosetta Stone for his political agenda and cultural outlook.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on the program, Alex. So, yeah, J.D. Vance talks about his grandparents as the best things that ever happened to him, and that they rescued him from being a statistic. You know, J.D. Vance's mom struggled with drug abuse, The household that he was raised in was often unstable. She cycled through a lot of boyfriends and husbands, and she was at times neglectful or even abusive. And his grandparents, his grandmother in particular, provided him with a refuge from that chaos and that instability. And what's funny about that is that his grandparents had also created a very volatile, sometimes violent, very unstable household for his own mother. And so there's kind of a generational trauma that's being handed down. But I think what's really interesting and what comes into sharp relief in one of the clips that you played before the break is that there's a really essential difference that he sees between his grandparents and his mother, which is that his grandparents stayed married. And I think that because his grandparents were so important to him, because they saved him from being a statistic, as he has put it, I think he's inscribed a lot of importance in their marriage and how they stuck it out through thick and thin. And I think that's gone a great deal towards shaping his ideology, his politics, and even some of his policy preferences.
Yeah, his idea that people should stay married no matter whether they're in violent relationships or not. I do want to ask, though, Jessica, in terms of the way he thinks of marriage and childbearing, he thinks of the family as kind of a uniquely conservative phenomenon. I mean, his wife worked for a San Francisco law firm until like 2 minutes ago. Does he not understand that Democrats have children and families too? It seems very asymmetrical, to be euphemistic about it.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely sees the traditional nuclear family of the mid 20th century, where dad goes to work and mom stays home with the kids, and everyone's getting by on a single income. That is the ideal that he wants to strive for. And the notion that a mother, a woman would want to work, would need to work out of economic necessity, or perhaps would just want to work for her own, personal fulfillment at a white shoe law firm, perhaps. That doesn't really enter the position when it comes to his political views and his economic outlook.
Sam, I am struck by how far outside the mainstream I think people have paid some attention to J.D. Vance, or people interested in Senate politics have, but the more you hear from this individual, the more weird is the word being used to describe his views. But, he's someone who said universal daycare. This is right before he announced the Senate run. Universal daycare is class war against normal people. I just want to make the point that his wife and he have 3 children, and at her law firm, they offer 12-hour on-site daycare. The disconnect. Do you have a thought about this?
I have multiple thoughts about it. I would say a couple things. One is it wasn't always this way. If you look at his biography, when he was a law student at Yale, for instance, and he was writing on his little blog. He had a personal blog back then, but he was also writing for conservative sites. The glimpse that you get of J.D. Vance is a different person. It's someone who's more socially liberal, more moderate and Republican in his republicanism. It's not that he's cosmopolitan or anything. I mean, he obviously had written his memoirs, about to write his memoir, and that was sort of the root of his political beliefs, but he certainly wasn't projecting this type of persona. I think what happened was, if I had to guess, that as he began to get more involved in national politics and he saw the way that the wind was blowing, he recognized that the sort of heart of the party was with this ideology. And that's been sort of personified, not just in his politics, but what you see in, for instance, Tucker Carlson's show for a while. The idea of the nuclear family is central to America and was being sort of rapidly deteriorated by Democrats. And so that's where he's coming from. It's part political ambition. I don't think it's all political ambition. I think he probably does believe some of these things genuinely. But now that it's being thrust into a national or in front of a national audience, it just lands differently, right? This is not Ohio. This is not rural Ohio. This is not Fox News or Tucker Carlson. This is a national audience. And I think a vast majority of not just women, but men sort of recoil at the idea that, if you're childless, somehow you're lesser.
Well, yeah, it's not only if you're childless that you're lesser. Stepmoms aren't really moms. Women should be staying in marriages even if they're violent marriages, and universal daycare is for people who are not normal. I mean, I just think, Jessica, when we talk about how he came to these views, you go back to Hillbilly Elegy. As Sam says, there seems to be an interregnum period where he's somewhat tethered to the reality that most of the country lives in, which is that people need daycare. But it almost seems like he sort of self-radicalizes with, harkening back to his roots, and then with the added, incentive of being on Fox News with Tucker Carlson. Do you have a sense of how deeply felt these ideals are?
Just to add on to what Sam was saying, if you go back to around the time that Hillbilly Elegy came out, a really interesting artifact from that general period is a TED Talk that he gave. And in that TED Talk, he talks about how he got out of the terrible situation that he was in, and that we should be affording more chances to more kids like young J.D. Vance to get a great education, reach the heights, aspire to the heights that he had attained even at that point in his career. And he's pretty explicit about the fact that he doesn't have policy solutions, that he's posing questions and trying to start a conversation, but he doesn't have the answers. And I think by the time he reached his Senate campaign, he'd found some answers, whether or not they were earnestly held all that time, whether or not they sort of were exaggerated outgrowths of feelings or instincts that he already had. I can't really speak to that. But there was definitely a period where he was kind of searching for where he wanted to land on these issues.
Well, he's landed in a very interesting place. Jessica Winter. Sam Stein, you stick around. I have many more questions for you. Jessica Winter, thank you for the great reporting. It is a really great read in this week's New Yorker.